If you'll open up to Luke chapter 15, we're going to talk about the prodigal son. Just kidding. Just kidding. It's kind of a rhythm at this point. We went all summer talking about that, and now it's the first chance I get, and we're not going to talk about it after the summer. I want to say welcome back tonight, and I want to briefly talk about something that got announced today, which is our event, our festival, our fall festival. I don't know how many fall festivals you've been to or what they've looked like, but we have a grand vision for this one. The idea is we want a community event similar to one of the first ones we had back in March, maybe it was March. We had that big event, and there was several people that came by, and we got to really love on the people of the community and just be kind to them and be loving to them and invite them to church. And we made a lot of great connections through that. And so, there's a great excuse to have these events when you line them up with the calendar that everyone else uses. So it's fall time. People want to do fall things, take pictures, carve pumpkins, do the whole nine. How about they do that here at our building? So that's the vision, is we're going to have some games for the kids. We're going to have some activities for the kids to do, some fun stuff like pumpkin carving or painting or three-legged race. I don't know. We'll make them jump around in a potato sack, however we want. And then we're also going to have some food and enjoy some food. We've talked before about the importance of eating together and how we see it come up in Scripture over and over and over again, and how that can be such a useful tool for reaching people and showing people the love of Christ and his church. And we're going to have, hopefully, some kind of hayride or place where we can take pictures. And this is where you come in. This requires manpower, right? We need someone to make sure that children with pumpkin carving tools don't carve themselves on accident, okay? We need someone to man that booth, right? We need someone to have a spot where people could take a family picture, a fall family picture, and someone to actually take the picture who's not terrible at it, and isn't going to take a bunch of selfies on accident. We need someone who is going to interact with the people who are visiting and taking a minute to eat, someone who's going to visit with them. We need people to throw in on this activity. And if we all do it together, it's going to be fantastic. It'll be a great time, and it'll be a great blessing, not just to those of us who are working it, but hopefully to everyone who gets to be a part of it too. So that is a glimpse of the vision. Hopefully that is clear as mud. And if you want to help, as some of you have already mentioned, just come see me. I've got a little list of things that we need some help with, and hopefully we will get this knocked out and make an impact in the community, because that is something Christians are called to do. So with that, just be praying about it as well. If you're not able to help in a physical capacity, be praying about it, and certainly that is great help as well. Let's jump into the lesson. I want to tell you about a TED Talk that I saw. Is anyone a fan of TED Talks? I love TED Talks. I got a whole playlist on YouTube of TED Talks that I love. I'll watch them one time, never watch them again, forget everything about them, but I enjoyed it. It was 15 minutes of information that I didn't need and loved getting. Sometimes, actually, you find a TED Talk that is so profound, though. You find some that are really interesting and they stick with you. Well, this one stuck with me. The idea behind it is sometimes the right thing doesn't seem like the right thing, right? Sometimes doing the right thing can seem completely backwards. This one particular TED Talk was called Great Leaders Do What Drug Addicts Do. And I was immediately intrigued by that. Would you not be? You can go look it up. That's what it's called. And this guy got up and he's doing a TED Talk about his business. As he goes through, you find out he is a recovered drug addict. He went through the Narcotics Anonymous program, and he went through all the steps, and he has been sober for a number of years at this point. Well, after he got sober and got his wits about him, he started a company, started a business. I believe they were developing or selling some kind of medical software, okay? Software that hospitals would use to monitor patients and that sort of thing. Now, I don't know all the details of it, but it was in that realm, and what had come of this business venture was an enormous contract that he was going to sign with one of those medical businesses. You know how you have like certain hospitals that have different names, and then you have like 10 hospitals that have the same name, like Medical City Louisville and Medical City Plano and Medical City. He was going to sign a contract with one of those overarching hospital brands, which would have been quite lucrative, right? I mean, he's not just got one hospital now that he's selling to or a couple of doctors' offices, but he would have been selling his program, selling his software to dozens of hospitals across the nation. And so he's getting ready, and the day before he is ready to make this sale, a couple of his machines failed. And it caused some complications for the patients because the software malfunctioned in some way. He said it was 2 specific times that this happened a day before the contract was set to come. And he had a major crisis of conscience on his hand. Now, this is where the drug addict part comes into play. See, he had learned in getting his life together through Narcotics Anonymous, which I don't know if you know much about this, but a lot of those 12-step programs have roots in faith, even though some of them try not to be as overt about it. But because of his roots in the Narcotics Anonymous program, one of the things they taught him was you have to be unreasonably honest about your mistakes, right? If you are a recovering drug addict, you cannot come to Narcotics Anonymous having relapsed and sit there like nothing happened, or else you will never get better. If the smallest thing tempted you, you need to share that with your sponsor. If you had a moment of weakness and you didn't go all the way, but you were close, you need to share that with your sponsor. It doesn't matter how small. You need to have radical honesty when it comes to your sobriety. Well, having that in his background, you can see the crisis that was right in front of him. 2 failures with his software that he could lie about and have a massive contract with these hospitals, or he could tell the truth about it and run the risk of losing his business. I mean, at this point, with the amount of money he had put into it, that would have been losing his livelihood, right? He said he wrestled with it all night. He was up all night thinking about it, praying about it, working through it, trying to figure out a way to lie without lying. You know, it didn't really malfunction. No one got hurt, right? Well, he woke up that morning and decided, this is about radical honesty. We're going to do the right thing. And so he calls the hospital that he was about to sign the contract with. He gets on the phone with them, and he says, just want you to know before we go through with this, 2 of my machines failed this week, you know, and it caused some complications. It wasn't great, you know, and they laughed at him. They got on the phone, they laughed at him. They said, are you kidding? Do you know what percentage of this kind of software fails on a regular basis? And sometimes it's not even reported. The fact that you had 2 machines fail only and called us about it makes us want to do even more business with you because you reported everything to us, even the smallest detail, when it ran such a great risk, right? Now, I think if all of us were sitting there in that situation, we'd have a level of crisis. I mean, we're humans, and we're being honest with ourselves. 2 machines out of, hundreds and hundreds of programs that this was run on failed. That's it. It's not that big of a deal. It's not. He could have done so many different things, but the right thing to everyone else looked so backwards that he was laughed at, right? In a good way, but laughed at for choosing radical honesty. Now, God seems to like working like this as well. When we think about how backwards that decision may seem to any number of business people or any number of people in that sort of field, that it looks very backwards. God likes to work that way too. God likes to work in a way that looks very backwards. All you have to do is think quickly through some of the stories that you've grown up hearing. Hey, Noah, build a giant boat and fill it with animals. I'm going to flood the world. Flood the world? Yes, the whole thing. Whoa. I mean, that seems a little backwards, doesn't it? Like, you're going to flood everything that you created, and I'm going to build a boat to rescue a remnant? What radical faith that would take. You think about Abraham. Abraham, who had his own crisis of faith and trusting God at different times, but always came out trusting God in the end. And then God says, you remember that promised child that came to you through a miraculous pregnancy and birth to your wife when she was way too old to be having any business doing that? Kill him. Kill him. Take him up to the mountain, offer him as a sacrifice to me. That was the command. I mean, talk about backwards. If you're trying to start a great nation, you don't begin by killing your firstborn son, right? So then what about any number of the prophets? We've talked about this in the past. What about the prophets who were told to do these absolutely bizarre acts in front of the whole nation? You think about Ezekiel, who had to simulate the siege of Jerusalem by laying on his side a certain number of days, being tied up, building a model of the city, destroying a model of the city, and eating his food cooked over unmentionable fire. I mean, Ezekiel, that's kind of backwards. You know, God, if you really want to get your message across clearly, you might want to do it a little more gently, you'd think, right? Or what about Isaiah? I mean, I've said this before, but he was the naked guy for 3 years. God, if you really want people to hear your message, you might want to use a different method. And yet God chooses over and over to do things in this seemingly backwards way. Think about who he chose to lead his people gently like a shepherd out of Egypt. Moses, the murderer. That's who he picked, right? Gentle shepherd, murderer. You don't usually see those together. Think about what he told Joshua. I mean, I could keep going here, right? Think about what he told Joshua. You're going to take the biggest city known to man, the most fortified city in the area, and you're going to get it by marching. Just march and blast your trumpets at the end, and the walls will fall down, you'll get them. What about Gideon? Hey, you don't need an army. You just need 300 guys, a couple of pots, a torch, and a trumpet. They'll kill themselves. Like, what in the world? And that's before we get to Jesus, right? Then Jesus comes on the scene, and he starts saying things like, you're going to have to be washed in my blood. Have you guys ever tried to wash something with blood? No, normally you're trying to get blood out of something, right? Like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's a pretty backwards way of thinking about things. What about when Jesus says that in order to have life, you're going to have to die? Well, that's just a straight up contradiction, isn't it? That's pretty backwards. What about when Paul teaches that slavery to Christ is freedom? I mean, slavery is freedom. That statement in and of itself doesn't make a lot of sense. It seems very backwards. What about when Jesus says that you're blessed when you suffer? You think about not just that one beatitude, but look at Matthew chapter 5 and how he begins the Sermon on the Mount. He said, blessed are those, are the poor in spirit, right? Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake, or for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the persecuted. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you. What? You're blessed when those things happen, Jesus? Really? That seems kind of backwards. And then if you don't even stop here in Matthew chapter 5 and you go read the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, if somebody smacks you upside the head, turn around and let them get the other side. If a soldier asks you to carry his armor for him by obligation, just keep going until you're tired or until he wears out, you know? Listen, Jesus is teaching on this, on all sorts of things. Not only is a little bit backwards to us, it was backwards at the time. When people listened to what Jesus said, some of them said these are hard teachings, right? Some of them said that's not what the law says. It seems like God has always been a fan of being a little backwards, doesn't it? It seems like a pretty consistent theme of God's character, that the way he instructs his people to act and live, it looks a little bit backwards. And it's incredible how many times people trust him. You think about what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. He says it twice within the first 3 verses. First, in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 25, he says that the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. All right? God's foolishness is wiser than your wisdom. Right? So if it seems backwards to you, just remember that's your wisdom, not God's. Then, just a couple chapters later, in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 19, Paul writes again in the same letter, for the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it's written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. Don't try and be crafty with God. He's going to get you. He's going to find it out. He catches the wise in their craftiness, because wisdom of this world, it's just silliness before God. And yet, after all of this, after we've seen that this is a pattern, after we've seen that he's come through, after we've seen that when people trust him it works out, we still struggle with it sometimes, don't we? We still struggle with the trusting of God's backwards system, don't we? We find it hard because what's the first thing we say when we hear something that sounds a little confusing? Well, we say, that's a little bit confusing, right? And it's reasonable, but you would think with this much evidence to support it, we might struggle a little bit less. I think there's a story that really exemplifies this well. Look at 2 Kings. Go back and look at the book of 2 Kings, chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5, we have the story of Naaman. Naaman was a commander in the army of the king of Syria. It tells us this right here in chapter 5 and verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. So right there we have the stage set for this very interesting character. He is not just a nobody who has leprosy and is an outcast. He is a mighty man of valor. There are a couple of people talked about like that throughout the Bible, and they're usually pretty bad guys. Not bad like good. All right? They're usually pretty ferocious guys, okay? All right? And he's also like number one in command of the whole army of Syria, who, if you remember, was one of the powers that overtook Israel, right? And so he is a leper, which presents a very challenging situation for him, because you don't want that to spread, but how do you hold back the commander of the entire army? So verse 2, now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel. She worked in the service of Naaman's wife, and she said to her mistress, "Would that my lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." All right. So they, on one of their raids, carry off this young girl who is an Israelite, and she tells them about this prophet who could cure him from his leprosy. And Naaman, hearing that, certainly desiring to be healed, brings it to the king. So, verse 4, Naaman went in and told his lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." So they hear about the prophet of God. I think this is really interesting, right? They hear about the prophet of God, and their first thought is, well, he's in Israel, so let's send you to the king of Israel. But the prophet was going to cure you. But let's go to the king. And when we go to the king, let's not go empty-handed and just ask for his favor. Let's load you up. We're going to give you, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. We're going to send you in there with the amount to give him that he cannot refuse, so to speak, right? The offer he couldn't refuse. So he sends him in, and they say in the letter, "Cure my commander of his leprosy," to the king, who cannot do that. So then in verse 7, when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me." Right? So he's very upset about this. This is not my position. This is not my job. Are you trying to start a fight with me? Right? Have you ever been in one of those situations where someone says something and you have just enough clarity to say, "Are you trying to start a fight with me?" This is the king of Israel right now. Right? Verse 8, but when Elisha, the man of God, remember the one who can cure him according to the young girl, but when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him. Okay. So like right off the bat, in terms of prestige of Naaman, what do you expect someone to do when they greet Naaman? He is the leader of the army of Syria. He is, by all accounts, a very impressive and prestigious person, okay? So much so that he has the ability to just walk right up to the king of Israel. That's not normal. Do you remember the story of Esther? Like, walking up to kings wasn't a normal thing. You didn't just go into the throne room and talk to the kings because you wanted to have a chat. So he has this authority. He has all of this money in his pockets. He's got these 10 changes of clothing, and he walks into the king. The king sends him to Elisha, and when he gets to Elisha's house, at the door of Elisha's house, Elisha sends a servant out to him. You would think at the very least he'd come say, hey. You would think at the very least he would say, I'm honored that you came to see me. Look at what God can do. You would think at the very least he would be excited to show what God could do. And yet all he does is just send a servant to the door. And the servant says in verse 10, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was angry. And he went away saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and that he would stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Now you kind of understand. He's not used to being treated like that. He's the commander of an army. He's a prestigious person. He's not used to having a servant come deliver him the news, right? And so, he meets it with rage. He's irate about it. And it's so funny that he had an idea of what was going to happen. Isn't this interesting? He had an idea of what this was going to look like. The prophet was supposed to come out, in Naaman's mind, was supposed to come out, say something incredible, wave his hand over the place, maybe do something cool, and then cure him with something incredible happening. And all he got was a servant at the door who said, go wash in the Jordan and be clean. And you know what? If I had to wash, I wouldn't pick the Jordan. Have you guys heard about how disgusting the Jordan River was? When me and my sisters were young in Pennsylvania, anytime it would rain, the very back of our yard would flood. Now, being 7 years old, I remember it being in a massive amount of water. It probably was a puddle. But I do also remember that if we ran in it enough, the grass clippings would rise to the top and it would become real murky, and we called it the Jordan River, right? Because the Jordan River was filthy. It was not the river you go to for clean, fresh water. And so Naaman, knowing this, says, in Damascus, there are 2 rivers way better than this one. At the very least, he could have sent me to a nice river. And then his servant taps him on the shoulder and says, hey. Let's keep reading. So he turned and went away in a rage, verse 13. But his servant came near and said to him, my father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? He has actually said to you, wash and be clean. The servant comes up behind him and, taps him on the shoulder is the way I see it happening. Came near to him. Taps him, he says, listen, he said something great. All right? He said, go wash and be clean. That's all there is to it. He didn't give you qualifiers. He didn't give you a bunch of really difficult things to do. It seems like Naaman would have rathered do something difficult and grand, and the servant has to bring his attention back and remind him, listen, he just told you something very simple. He gave you incredible news. Let's just for a second put this in modern context. And let's say you've got some very serious disease. Very serious, right? It's terminal. You know that at let's say 1 year, you are probably not going to make it to the next year. And so you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, you just need to start drinking more water. You just need to start drinking more water, and then you'll get healed. It'll go away. If you just drink more water, 8 ounces, 8 cups a day, something like that, right? If you just drink more water, you'll be good. That's good news, right? That would be great news. Naaman would go away from that doctor upset that they didn't prescribe him a strong enough medicine, right? But in this situation, the servant taps him and he reminds him, this is incredible news. You can be clean by just dipping in a pool. That's awesome. And yet Naaman was unable to see that at the time. But verse 14, so he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. when you trust what God says, even if it feels like it's backwards, it works out. He's got a proven track record. But now, I think this is not just a problem Naaman struggled with, but a problem that we struggle with. Sometimes it's easier to build a boat than it is to pray to God. All right, sometimes we would rather God give us a task that was huge and rigorous and something that we could tangibly put our hands on than just pray to him about it and let it go. This is, I think, a human thing. I don't think it's a Naaman thing. I think it's a human thing. And so we're going to look at a couple of things really quickly. Situations in which we have been given a slightly backwards but very simple answer by God and what he has said about these situations. Sometimes the simple answer doesn't cut it for us, and we need someone to tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, don't forget, this is a great thing. The first thing is anxiety. In our world, anxiety has become an epidemic. It is something that is sweeping our 21st century America, 2022 America. It's taken America by storm, anxiety has. I mean, everyone is struggling with anxiety. There are different types of anxiety that are all pretty recently diagnosable disorders. There are new medications coming up all the time that are meant to diagnose or to treat anxiety disorders. There are solutions on the internet there are more solutions for anxiety than you would believe when you just Google it. There's page after page after page after page. Things like meditation apps. Get an app, meditate, anxiety melts away. Things like go to therapy, which is really helpful. Go to therapy, talk to someone about it, anxiety will melt away. Social media fasts. Quit doing Instagram or Facebook, and anxiety will go away. Minimalist living. I didn't know that was a cure for anxiety, but it kind of makes sense. Get rid of all of your things and simplify your life, and anxiety will go away. Like we said, diagnoses of different disorders or medicines. Take this medicine regularly, and your anxiety will go away. Not to mention some of our own solutions to the problem. You know, the ones like perpetually needing a break, right? I just need to work hard until I get to, have you ever done this? I do this all the time. I just need to get to Sunday night. When I'm done with Bible class and done with the lesson, then I can watch football. That's usually how it works in my brain. I just need to make it to Tuesday after that presentation, and then I've got Wednesday to kind of catch back up on stuff, right? Or maybe it's our own solutions to anxiety are the dopamine hits or the entertainment that we're looking forward to. Yeah, you know what? I just need to watch one episode of my favorite show, and then I'll get on the stuff that's giving me anxiety, right? It's all over our world. You really don't have to try that hard to see anxiety impacting our world and impacting the church and members of the church. And I hope it's very clear, none of these things am I trying to belittle or say are not helpful. They can be helpful to a number of different people in a number of different ways. But the Bible doesn't talk about meditation apps, right? The Bible has some things that you can do that are pretty simple, like Naaman, and I think if we trust God, are going to be more helpful when we do them in faith. So what does the Bible say about this? Well, look at Philippians chapter 4, a verse I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with in one way or another, but Philippians chapter 4. Paul, getting towards the end of this book, is wrapping up, well, Ephesians. Ephesians. I meant Philippians. I think I said Philippians, and I just turned to the wrong book. But down towards the end of this book, Paul is wrapping up his letter, and he's getting to the end, and he's giving this prayer and these instructions on how they need to live in light of so much of what he's just said. And he gets to verse 4 of chapter 4, and he says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I'll say, rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. And do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Paul gives us a really simple solution to this problem. Now, hear me very clearly. I'm not saying that you do this one time and your anxiety goes away forever. I don't think that's the intent of what Paul is saying either. I think what he's saying is there is a practice, a regular practice. There is I guess I'd say it like this. There's a look of someone who is doing these things, and they don't have the anxieties. of the people who are not. Well, what are the things that he encourages us to do? The first thing is to be rejoicing. Now, that doesn't mean you're always smiling and happy. That means you are joyful. There is a sense of joy, satisfaction, completeness that you have because your focus is bigger than just this moment. He says, let your reasonableness be known to everyone, right? There's a reasonableness that you should have. And then he says, don't be anxious about everything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, right? So instead of being anxious, we need to pray. Well, that's not big enough. What else can I do? Pray. Hey, it's a good thing that God gave us a solution to anxiety as simple as prayer. You can do it anytime you want to. You can do it right now if the lesson's boring you. Right? You could do it in the car on your way home. You could do it anytime you have a second. You could do it with people. You could do it by yourself. You could do it in your closet. You could do it in your bed. You could wake up and do it and then go back to sleep because you fell asleep in the middle of it because you closed your eyes and got too still. You could do it whenever you want to. It's a really good thing that God gave us a solution to anxiety as simple as prayer. It may not feel frontwards, right? It may not feel like the best solution. Well, I didn't knock anything off my list by praying. I didn't accomplish anything by praying. I didn't reduce my stressors by praying. But God said, through Paul here, don't be anxious, pray. And there's a little caveat here that he says, with thanksgiving. It's not just prayer, but it's thankful prayer. Psychologists have found it is actually much harder to be stressed out when you are being grateful for things. It is much more difficult to see all the things that are pressing on you and making your life harder when you are grateful for something that you have. It makes good sense, and yet sometimes we don't do the simple things that God has told us are solutions to so many of the problems in our world. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. See, the prophet told Naaman through a servant, go dip in the water and you will be clean. God told us, pray with thanksgiving and you will have peace. It's a good thing that God gave us such a beautiful, simple answer. Maybe it feels backwards, but God's got a pretty good track record. Second thing, and we'll be short on this, is humility. In our world, and we don't have to go over too much of this because Brother Michael did 6 months on it or something like that. And, in our world, this idea of it's all about you. It's all about you. The title of class was being selfless in a selfie world. In other countries, and I don't know that this is indicative of us being more selfish than them, but in other countries, they call it an ussie. When you take a picture with somebody, what do we call it? A selfie. There's the problem, right? So listen, you may hear phrases like, hey, bet on yourself. You can do it. We take Philippians 4:13 and we make it all about who? Me. I can do all things. Sometimes we don't even finish it. Like sometimes we just leave it right there. What about when people talk about building your brand, right? All about your reputation and how people think about you. What are you going to do about making your world or your life better? Take your financial freedom in your hands. I mean, there's any number of scenarios you can find somebody talking about how to do it yourself, right? That's not terrible. We need to have some accountability as humans. God wants people to be doers. God wants people to be concerned with their influence, as Chandler mentioned this morning in his thoughts after the lesson. These are all important things. I'm not writing every single bit of that off. But what does the Bible say about being exalted? What does the Bible say when someone is proud? Look at James chapter 4. James chapter 4 and verse 6 says, but he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourself before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Yeah, it's a real paradoxical thing, huh? If you want to be exalted, you have to humble yourself, which kind of means if you want to be exalted, You can't, all right? You kind of have to not want to be exalted in order to humble yourself in order to be exalted. So it's a real difficult, real touchy situation. But the truth of the matter is, this is a really simple solution. Easy? No. But simple? Yes. If you want God to glorify you, to make your world go the way that you would like it to go, first of all, you need to want it to go the way God wants it to go, because he's not going to do things outside of his will. But second of all, the solution here is very simple. You humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. When you are before God, remember your place. He loves you. He wants great things for you. But remember, he's God. He's the one who will be glorified. He's the one whose name is great. If you humble yourself before the Lord, he will lift you up. And this should impact how you interact with others as well. In Philippians, Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourself. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Humility is an element of the Christian walk. And the solution is very simple. When you humble yourself before God, he will exalt you, and he will be glorified as a result of it. Last one, number 3, is suffering. Suffering is a really challenging thing. I think I've told you before that suffering is usually recently been the number one thing that people cite as the reason for losing their faith. They believe that suffering in the world is the sign that God is not there, or that if there is a God, there shouldn't be suffering, or that suffering is something that a good God wouldn't let happen, so maybe there's a God, but he's not good. This is usually the rhetoric around suffering. And as a result, people have a tendency to try and distract from suffering. When they're hurting, they want to do something that gets their mind off of it, or they run from suffering. They just try and get as far away from it as possible, or they try to numb the pain that is associated with suffering in this world through various different methods, or they try to avoid it altogether, and they structure their life in a way that will not let them get into a suffering situation. Suffering is something that is difficult. And so we have all these ways to try and get away from it, get around it, get through it. But what does the Bible say about suffering? James chapter 5. James chapter 5 and verse 13. It says it very simple. He says, is anyone among you suffering? 3 words. Let him pray. Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Right? Think about what he says, what the psalmist writes in Psalm chapter 46 and verse 10. Though the world is crumbling around you, is the general tone of the psalm. What does he say? Psalm 46 and verse 10, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations, and I will be exalted in the earth. Take a breath. Remember, even though you see suffering, I am still. God, I am still in control. And what does Jesus tell his disciples in John chapter 16 and verse 33? He says, in this world, you're going to have suffering. You'll have tribulation. It's coming. I think I've told you guys before about the bull riding shirt. It's not if, it's when and how bad. When you ride bulls, it's not about if you get hurt. It's about when and where did he kick you, right? Jesus says the same. In this world, you're going to have suffering. You're going to have trials, but take heart. I've overcome the world. Hey, I know you see all the suffering, but it's a good thing that God gave us these simple, not easy, but simple answers to deal with the suffering in our world until his kingdom has fully come. As we wrap up, I want to ask one more question and answer it. Why, if God has such a proven track record and his answers to things are so simple, why do we struggle with them so much? I think the answer is because they look kind of backwards. How does just praying about it fix my suffering? How does being thankful and praying help me to be less anxious? How does humbling myself actually exalt me and glorify God? Well, you know, it can look backwards, but at the end of the day, if we struggle to do these things, it's one of 2 reasons. There are one of 2 reasons for it. Either number 1, we don't trust God enough. I think this really shows itself in honesty and dishonesty. When it comes to things like, gain or business decisions or relationships where, telling the truth might not be advantageous, we have a tendency not to want to do that thing, right? I think all of us have experienced that at one time or another. Hey, I don't really want to be honest about this right now because I don't think it will help X situation. Now, if we truly trust God, that honesty is going to set us free. The truth will set us free. If we trust that is true, and if we trust what God has told us, we'll do the simple thing, right? If Naaman trusted that what Elisha told him would cleanse him, he would have gone and done it immediately. He had a problem with it and he didn't trust it. I've got better rivers back home. He didn't wave his hand. He didn't come out to meet me. I don't trust it. And I think we run into the same problem when we have a hesitancy to do the simple things that God has asked us that will fix so many of our difficulties in this world. Sometimes we just don't trust God enough. And you know what? That puts us in some pretty good company. Have you read the Old Testament? Have you read the New? Have you heard about Peter? Listen, as humans, we struggle with trusting God. The challenge is not, don't ever do the wrong thing. We're going to struggle with trusting God. God just wants us to do it at every opportunity that we have, to choose to trust him at every chance and try to trust that what he says will happen. The second reason I think that we don't do the simple things has to do with thinking we can do it our way better. I tried to think of a better example, but I really struggled. I felt like this one worked so well. So I don't love the example, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from on this. When it comes to our world and sexual fulfillment, our world has a way of saying that you will receive that, right? Have as many partners as you want, do whatever you want, do it whenever you want, whatever feels good, do it. It's your body, your choice, right? Our world has a very clear method for having fulfillment in your sexual relations, right? The Bible has a really simple answer to that, and it says don't try and fill up your satisfaction. Rather, let your desire be for your husband. Let your desire be for your wife. Right? The Bible has a completely backwards way of looking at that. And at the end of the day, when we look at those two choices and we choose the one that our culture tells us is the right answer, we're just telling God we feel like we can do it better. And that's no different than Abraham trying to have a son with Hagar. That's no different than Moses striking the rock instead of speaking to the rock. This is, again, a problem that humans have in trusting God. Sometimes the reason we don't do the simple thing is because we don't trust him enough or we believe that we can do it better. So the challenge is very simple. Trust God and his backwards way of doing things. He's been doing it a long time. And he has a spotless record. Every time someone has chosen to trust God, it's worked out in their best interest. If you remember over the summer, pretty early on, Kirk Brothers, in his Bible theme lesson, had the theme Upside Down. And he went through, it was a brilliant lesson. He went through and he talked about how the Christians in Acts were turning the world upside down, and how Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount was turning the law upside down, right? And then he talked about how God created the world in Genesis 1, and his whole point of the lesson was, it's not upside down if God made it like that, right? And here's the truth of the matter. If it looks backwards to us, but God said to do it, we're the ones who are backwards. Amen. God's backwards way isn't backwards at all. Because he says it, it's the right way. And so it's time that we remember, spend some time in God's word, meditate on his law day and night, and trust the things that he has told us. Trust some of the simple answers, even though that's not always the easiest thing to do. And trust that he's going to do what he said he's going to do.